A polar vortex, a smear of blood across fresh snow, and a man collapsed against her back fence. She had 30 seconds to decide whether to call it in or drag him through her kitchen door. Choosing the second thing didn't just change her night. It changed everything that came after. The wind off Lake Ontario had teeth that night. It came screaming down the escarpment and through the orchards outside Niagara on the lake, the kind of cold that made the hydro lines hum and the old maples crack like gunshots. Environment Canada had been calling it a once-in-a-decade system since noon, and by 8 o'clock half the QEW was a parking lot of stranded transports and salt trucks that couldn't keep up. Bryn Aldecott didn't care about any of that. She cared about getting the heat pump running before the pipes seized, and she cared about the 11 hours of paperwork she still owed the vet clinic, and she cared distantly about the fact that she hadn't eaten since the granola bar she'd choked down at 6 that morning between surgeries. She was 29 years old, and most days she still introduced herself as just a vet tech. Though anyone who'd watched her hands work a suturing needle at 3 in the morning on an emergency C-section would have argued the word just didn't belong anywhere near her. She'd grown up 2 concessions over, raised by a grandmother who fixed fences and birthed calves with her own 2 hands, and there wasn't much about a wounded body, animal or otherwise, that rattled her anymore. That was until she rounded the corner of her own backyard with an armful of firewood and nearly stepped on a man. He was sprawled half against the cedar fence post, one leg twisted under him at an angle that made her stomach drop before her brain caught up. The snow around him wasn't white anymore. It was the wrong color, a deep spreading red-black that had already crusted at the edges in the cold, and steam was still rising faintly off the worst of it, which told her with brutal clarity that whatever had happened to him had happened recently. Minutes, not hours. She dropped the wood. She didn't remember deciding to. Hey, can you hear me?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, the same flat, clipped calm she used on owners sobbing over a dying dog, because panic helped nobody and she'd trained that reflex into herself a long time ago. His eyes opened. They were a strange, pale amber, almost gold in the porch light, startling against a face gone grey with blood loss. He was maybe mid-30s, dark hair plastered down with melting snow, jaw shadowed with 2 days of stubble, and underneath the ruined remains of what had clearly once been an obscenely expensive black overcoat, a dress shirt soaked through and clinging to a torso that was, despite everything, absurdly well put together. Bryn noticed that fact and was immediately disgusted with herself for noticing it at a moment like this. "Don't," he rasped when her hand went toward her coat pocket and her phone. "No ambulance. No police. You're going into shock. You've lost a serious amount of blood. I can see at least 2. No hospitals." His hand closed around her wrist before she'd even registered him moving, a grip with a strength in it that didn't match a man who should, by every clinical measure, have been unconscious. Please. It was the please that got her. Men who said please while bleeding out in the snow weren't usually the ones doing the bleeding out, other people kind of work. Or so she told herself, in the half-second before logic lost the argument entirely. "You're insane," she muttered, already crouching to get her shoulder under his arm. "You know that, right? Completely insane." "Probably," he agreed, and then his eyes rolled back and he went heavy against her, and she had exactly 4 seconds to brace before 200 pounds of unconscious stranger took her down into the snowbank with him. Getting him through the back door and onto her kitchen floor took everything she had. She was strong. Years of wrestling Holsteins and St. Bernards had seen to that. But he was dead weight, and by the time she'd dragged him across the threshold, her arms were shaking, and her good wool sweater was ruined beyond saving. She worked the way she'd been trained to work, which was to say, she stopped thinking about who he was, and started thinking only about what he was. A body with a problem that needed solving before it stopped being solvable. She cut the shirt away with the kitchen shears she normally used on bandage gauze for dog patients. 2 stab wounds, one shallow along the ribs, one deep and ugly in the abdomen, packed with what looked like someone's attempt at field dressing using a torn strip of his own shirt. Somebody had tried to keep him alive before her. Somebody who knew enough to apply pressure but not enough, or didn't have the supplies, to do it properly. She packed the wound the way she'd pack one on a dog hit by a truck, with sterile gauze from her own kit, because she kept a human-grade trauma bag in her truck out of habit from 4-H first aid days and wrapped it tight enough to slow the bleeding without cutting circulation. She got the space heater from the hall closet and angled it directly at him, peeled off his soaked overcoat, piled the good wool blanket from the back of the couch over his shaking frame. He came back to consciousness somewhere around the time she was checking his pulse for the 4th time, fingers pressed to his throat, close enough that his eyes opened directly into hers. "You smell like antiseptic," he said, voice thin but lucid now. "And Cedar, you smell like you nearly died in my backyard." She sat back on her heels. "Which, for the record, you very nearly did." A faint, pained twitch at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile, brutally honest. "I appreciate that, actually. What's your name?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might pass out again. Then Roan Holloway. It would be hours before she learned that wasn't entirely a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth either. She sat on the edge of her coffee table through most of that long, terrible night, knees pulled to her chest, a mug of coffee gone cold and untouched in her hands, watching the rise and fall of his chest like it was the only thing keeping the house standing. Every gust that rattled the storm windows made her flinch. Every creak of the old farmhouse settling sent her eyes snapping to the front door. She told herself it was just adrenaline working its way out of her system. She didn't quite believe it. Around 4 in the morning, he woke again, more alert this time, and watched her with those strange amber eyes in a way that made her feel thoroughly seen. "You should have let me die out there," he said. "Probably," she agreed, echoing him without meaning to. "Why didn't you want the hospital?" "Because the people who did this to me have friends in places that would make sure I never left it." He shifted, hissed through his teeth at the pain, settled again. "And because if anyone connects your name to mine before I've handled this, you'll be in more danger sitting in your own kitchen than I currently am bleeding on your floor. That's not remotely reassuring." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." She should have asked him to leave the second he could stand. She told herself that for years afterward, the version of the story she'd never quite managed to tell anyone properly. Instead, she made him weak tea with honey, because that was what her grandmother always did for shock, and sat with him until the grey Ontario dawn came up over the orchard, and somewhere in those hours, without either of them deciding it, the line between stranger and something else got blurred past repair. She slept maybe 2 hours, curled in the armchair across from the couch, and woke to absolute silence. The wrong kind of silence, the kind that comes after a storm has finally exhausted itself. Watery sunlight cracked through the curtains. She sat up too fast, heart already hammering, and went straight to the front window. The driveway and the quiet country road beyond it, normally empty but for the occasional pickup, was full of vehicles. Not police cruisers, not ambulances, black SUVs, dozens of them, engines idling, exhaust plumbing white against the snow, lined up along both shoulders of the road in a formation too precise, too deliberate, to be anything but intentional. Men in dark wool coats stood beside them in pesas, hands clasped in front of them, utterly still, the way soldiers stand when they're waiting on an order. At the head of the line, closest to a front walk, a tall man in a charcoal overcoat stood alone, watching her house with an expression she couldn't read from this distance, and didn't particularly want to get closer to find out. Bryn's mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the hardwood. "They found me," said a voice behind her, low and grim. Roan, if that was even his name, had pulled himself upright on the couch, one hand braced against the wound at his side, face white with the effort, watching the same scene through the gap in the curtain. "That's faster than I expected." Someone talked. "Who are those people?" "Mine," he said, and there was something in the word, not pride, exactly, but a kind of exhausted ownership that told her this was about to be a much longer conversation than she had coffee for. "My family's people. The man at the front is Aldrich Voss." He runs security for the Calder-Whitmore syndicate. My syndicate, technically, though as of about 18 hours ago, my cousin seems to have decided otherwise." "Your syndicate?" She said the word like it might bite her. "You're telling me you're some kind of crime boss," he supplied, with a grimness that suggested he wasn't enjoying the reveal any more than she was receiving it. Heir to it, anyway, was heir to it. There's some debate this morning about whether that's still true. She turned from the window to stare at him properly, fully, for the first time since she'd hauled him bleeding through her back door. Not as a patient anymore, but as the impossible thing he'd just told her he was. The expensive, ruined coat, the custom-engraved sidearm she'd quietly moved off the coffee table and into a kitchen drawer sometime around 2 a.m., telling herself she'd deal with it later. The way he gave orders, even half-conscious, like a man who expected to be obeyed. "You let me cut your shirt off with my dog-grooming scissors," she said faintly. "I noticed. I was very brave about it." There wasn't time to be angrier than that, because the front door, locked and bolted, took that exact moment to shudder under 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. What followed was the strangest hour of Bryn Aldercott's entire life. Roan Calder-Whitmore, as it turned out, though he didn't give her the full name until much later, in the relative safety of a different house entirely, refused to let her open the door, and instead made her stand back from the windows while he conducted a low, controlled conversation through 3 inches of solid oak with the man called Aldrich Voss. She caught fragments. "Her brother thinks you're dead. The ledger is the only thing keeping half the city honest. I am not walking out there until I know which version of my family is standing on that lawn." It ended eventually with Aldrich Voss alone stepping inside, hands visibly empty, while the rest of the convoy held position on the road like an army waiting for a verdict. He was older than Roan, grey at the temples, with the watchful stillness of a man who had spent 30 years making sure other people didn't have to be afraid. And the relief that crossed his face at the sight of Roan upright and breathing was, Bryn thought, entirely real. "Cassian gave the order himself," Voss said quietly, once he'd confirmed with his own eyes that Roan was alive and roughly intact. "Told the family you died in the warehouse fire on the Welland Canal. Told them he'd take the chair as acting head until your estate cleared. He's already moved on the port's contract. 2 days, and it'll be irreversible." "My own cousin," Roan said, and something genuinely dangerous moved behind those amber eyes, something Bryn hadn't seen there yet, not even when he'd been holding a gun on his own thigh in her snow. "He had me stabbed in a parking garage and left for dead in a blizzard, and the first thing he did with the news was call a board meeting. Power's a disease in that family," Voss said grimly. "Always has been." Bryn stood frozen by her own refrigerator, listening to 2 men discuss attempted murder and corporate hostile takeovers in the same breath, and felt the floor of her ordinary, unremarkable life tilt permanently sideways. It was Voss who finally turned to look at her properly, taking in the blood-stained kitchen towels, the makeshift trauma kit spread across her counter, the dried blood still under her fingernails. Something shifted in his expression. Calculation, maybe, or respect, or both. "You're the one who pulled him out of the snow. I'm the one who's regretting it currently." A short, surprised laugh from Roan, quickly swallowed by a wince of pain. "Fair. She saved your life," Voss said to him, not unkindly, "and she's compromised now, whether she likes it or not. Cassian's people will canvass this whole concession line by morning, looking for where you went to ground. She can't stay here." That was the moment the full weight of the last 12 hours finally landed on Bryn. Not the blood, not the gun, not even the impossible row of black SUVs parked along her quiet country road, but the simple, devastating fact that her life, the one she'd built carefully out of long clinic shifts and her grandmother's old farmhouse and Sunday dinners with her sister in St. Catherine's, was already gone. It had ended the moment she'd dropped that armful of firewood in the snow, and she just hadn't known it yet. "Compromised how?" she said very quietly. "What does that even mean for me?" Roan looked at her then with an expression that was equal parts guilt and something rawer underneath it, something that hadn't been there before the fever and the blood loss. before 12 hours of her hands keeping him alive. "It means," he said, "that the only place safe enough for you now is wherever I am. I am so sorry. I never wanted to drag you into this." "You didn't drag me," she said. "I dragged you through my own back door, with my own 2 hands." "Then I suppose," he said, with the ghost of that same pained, almost smile, "we're both responsible for the mess." There was no time to argue the philosophy of fault. Voss was already moving, barking quiet, efficient instructions into a radio clipped to his collar. "Perimeter sweep, secure transport, get the doctor on standby at the lake house." And within 20 minutes Bryn found herself, against every shred of good sense she possessed, climbing into the back of an armored SUV with a stranger she'd known for less than a day, a duffel bag of clothes she'd packed with shaking hands, and a single photograph of her grandmother snatched off the mantel at the last second, because some part of her brain had understood, even in the chaos, that she might not be coming back to that farmhouse for a very long time. The convoy moved north, away from the lake, toward a property near Muskoka that Voss referred to only as the safe house, though calling it a house felt almost insulting once they arrived. A sprawling timber and stone estate set back from a frozen lake, ringed by cedar and silence, and more armed men in dark coats than Bryn had ever wanted to see in one place. It was there, over the following 2 days, that the rest of it came out in pieces, the way the truth always seems to when somebody's been carrying it too long alone. The Calder Whitmore family had run shipping out of the Great Lakes ports for 3 generations. Legitimate freight on the surface, and underneath it, the kind of business that didn't show up on any manifest. Roan's father had built it. Roan, the eldest, had been groomed to inherit it since boyhood, while his cousin Cassian, raised in the same house but always one rung lower, had spent 30 years watching and resenting and waiting. When the old man finally died the previous spring, he'd left the whole operation to Roan, on the explicit written condition that Cassian never be allowed near the port's contracts. A stipulation born, Rowan admitted quietly, of years of watching his cousin's appetite for cruelty outpace even what the family business required. Cassian hadn't waited long to test that boundary. He'd been quietly courting a partnership with a much darker network out of Hamilton. Trafficking routes disguised as freight, the kind of business that made even hardened criminals flinch. And when Rowan refused to sign off, refused even to discuss it, Cassian had simply decided to remove the obstacle. A parking garage, 3 men. A blade meant to look like a robbery gone wrong, in a city with cameras everywhere except the one corner Cassian's people had quietly disabled a week in advance. "I should have seen it coming," Rowan told her, on the second night, the 2 of them sitting by the enormous stone fireplace while the rest of the house slept, his color finally returning, the doctor's stitches holding. "I knew what he was capable of. I think some part of me just didn't want to believe family could do that to family. My grandmother used to say, 'Blood doesn't make people kind,'" Bryn said. "It just makes them obligated to pretend for a while." He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded in his face that hadn't been there with the gun, or the convoy, or the careful, controlled way he spoke to Voss and the rest of his men. "Your grandmother sounds like she knew a few things. She also said, 'Never trust a man who doesn't eat what you cook him. You ate 3 bowls of my soup tonight. For what it's worth." "For what it's worth," he said. "It was the best thing I've eaten in longer than I'd like to admit. Possibly because I almost didn't get to eat anything ever again." It was a small joke, the kind 2 exhausted people make to keep from talking about the larger frightening thing sitting in the room with them, but it was the first time she'd heard him laugh, actually laugh. Not the brief surprised huff from her kitchen and something in her chest, something she absolutely did not have room for right now, turned over quietly and refused to turn back. The danger didn't go away because they'd retreated to a lake house in the middle of nowhere. If anything, it sharpened the way Voss explained it. Cassian now knew Roan was alive, knew the takeover had stalled, and a wounded man with a grudge and a private army was infinitely more dangerous than a contained one. There were 2 more attempts in the following week. The first was subtle, a delivery to the property that turned out, on inspection, to contain something considerably more lethal than groceries. The second was not subtle at all, a pair of vehicles that tailed Voss's convoy for 11 kilometers on the highway before peeling off when they realized they'd been made. Through all of it, Bryn watched Roan transform, piece by piece, from the broken, bleeding stranger on her kitchen floor into something else entirely. Calm, exact, terrifyingly competent. A man making calls from the study at all hours, rebuilding loyalty among the family's lieutenants one careful conversation at a time, turning the very stillness Cassian had assumed would be weakness into the foundation of a counterattack. She understood, watching him, why an entire convoy of armed men had once stood silent and orderly on a snowy road, waiting for him to walk out a door. There was a gravity to him that had nothing to do with money or violence. People organized themselves around him the way iron filings find a magnet. It would have been easier. She thought more than once, if she could have hated him for any of it, she didn't. That was the inconvenient truth she kept circling back to, late at night, lying awake in the guest room down the hall from his, listening to the lake wind move through the cedars. She didn't hate the danger he'd brought into her life. She hated a little how much she didn't mind it. The end, when it came fast, the way these things tend to once the dam finally breaks. Roan had been quietly rebuilding for nearly 3 weeks, calling in markers, securing the loyalty of the dockworkers' union his father had spent decades cultivating, working with a forensic accountant Voss, trusted to trace the shell companies Cassian had used to fund the hit. When the call came that the noose had finally tightened far enough, Bryn was in the kitchen of the lake house, of all places, teaching the cook's teenage daughter how to properly debride a wound on the family's elderly retriever, when Voss appeared in the doorway with an expression she'd learned, by now, to be afraid of. "He's making his move tonight," Voss said. "Cassian. He knows we've been circling him. He's panicking, which means he's dangerous in a different way now. Roan wants you in the safe room until it's done." She found Roan in the study, loading the same custom kimber she'd once locked in her own kitchen drawer, his face set in a way that made him look 10 years older and entirely unlike the gentle, joking man who'd eaten 3 bowls of her soup. "You don't have to do this yourself," she said. "Yes," he said simply, "I do. He's my responsibility." He always was. I just didn't want to see it. He looked up at her, and for one unguarded second, the fear underneath the calm showed through completely. "If something happens to me tonight, nothing's happening to you tonight." She crossed the room and took the gun gently out of his hands, set it on the desk, and put both her own hands against his face instead, the way she might steady a frightened animal. Except he wasn't an animal, and this wasn't a clinic, and her heart was hammering for entirely different reasons than adrenaline now. "I didn't drag you out of a snowbank just to lose you to your idiot cousin in a lake house in March. You're going to go deal with this, and you're going to come back, and then you're going to explain to me, properly, what exactly I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life, now that it apparently includes armed convoys and forensic accountants." Something in his face broke open then, raw and grateful and disbelieving, and he kissed her. Quick, fierce, entirely unplanned by either of them. Before Voss's voice came sharp down the hallway calling his name, and he was gone, out into the dark with 20 of his father's men at his back. The night that followed was the longest of Bryn's life, longer even than the one in her own kitchen with his blood on her hands, because this time there was nothing for her hands to do but wait. She sat with the cook's daughter and the dog in the safe room behind the wine cellar, listening to nothing, hearing nothing, the silence somehow worse than any sound could have been, until past 2 in the morning, Voss's voice came through the radio, hoarse and exhausted, and unmistakably relieved. It was over. Cassian had been taken at the Hamilton warehouse, where he'd been meeting his trafficking contacts. The forensic accountant's evidence laid out so thoroughly that even the family's own internal counsel, the old men who'd known both cousins since boyhood, who'd have forgiven almost anything except this, voted unanimously to strip him of every claim he'd ever had to the Calder Whitmore name. He would not see the inside of a courtroom. That wasn't how the family handled its own. But he would never again stand in a parking garage with a blade and a grudge. And that, Voss said quietly, was the only justice this particular world had ever really offered. Roan came back to the lake house an hour before dawn, bruised, exhausted, but whole, and found Bryn waiting on the front steps in her grandmother's old wool coat, having refused every suggestion that she go to bed until she'd seen him walk through that door with her own eyes. "It's done," he said. "I know." Voss radioed, "I meant." He stopped, looked at her properly. The strain of 3 weeks and one impossible night finally visible all at once on his face. "I meant it's actually done. The danger, my family, all of it. I don't know what comes next for either of us. I don't know how a woman who fixes farm dogs for a living is supposed to build a lair around a man who runs half the shipping lanes on the Great Lakes. I don't even know if that's a life you'd want." Bryn thought about the farmhouse outside Niagara-on-the-Lake, sitting empty under 3 weeks of fresh snow, and the clinic that had probably already replaced her, and the version of her own future she'd been quietly building before a stranger bled into her backyard and rewrote every plan she'd ever made. "Ask me again," she said. "After you've eaten my soup a 4th time, I have a policy. I only build a life with men who finish their bowl." He laughed, really laughed, the sound rough with exhaustion and disbelief, and something that, against every probability the last month had presented, looked very much like hope, and pulled her into the cold morning air against his chest. And for the first time since she'd knelt in the snow over a dying stranger, the silence around them felt like something other than danger. It felt, instead, like the beginning of an entirely different story, one neither of them had asked for, and neither of them in the end was willing to give back.